Here we are, ethical hacking, chapter 8. Let's talk about hacking all of these random portable devices. So when we get done with all this, you will understand these things. Devices attacks, the tools that are out there, the security tools that are out there, and then what kind of countermeasures you can have. All the things you read in this chapter, right? So there is a thing called a universal serial bus. You might have encountered it at this point, where you can plug in some kind of peripheral, any kind of I/O, input, output, keyboards, mice, storage, you name it. USB port is that plug-and-play hardware thing on the side of your computer where you can plug stuff in. It's nice because it is a standard that you can use just about with any type of computer, be it an Apple, an iPad, an iPod. Believe it or not, usually you can get an Android device to accept a USB interface, so very convenient. As time's gone on, these things have got faster and faster. We started out with 1.5 meg, and everybody was like, oh, that's super fast. Nobody's ever going to need more than that. These days, we're up to about 600 megabits a second, enough that most hypervisor-type operating systems, ESXi, for example, recommend that you boot off of one of these deals and save the hard drives for the actual virtual machines. So they're subject to attack. You can, like, electrically sometimes get storage passwords off of devices directly from their electronic programmable onboard memory. Sometimes you can find flaws in these devices, in the software. So like any other piece of software, they're susceptible to things like buffer overflows. If you've got a buffer overflow in a USB device driver, you can gain administrative access because you start at the level of the device system in the operating system, which is very low level. However, you would need physical access to a system, and if you have physical access to a system, you basically own it anyway. Some people use epoxy to make sure that nothing's ever going to go into a USB port, which isn't terrible. You can go through and wipe firmware out, but it's not as sure as filling the hole up with epoxy. Your AV can be configured to scan things once it's plugged in there. Windows has a setting called auto run that when a device is plugged in, it starts running. This is an idea that came out of the CD-ROM era, and the fear was that people weren't with it enough to understand that they had to put in the CD-ROM and then they had to open it up and then they had to run the programs on the CD-ROM, so they would just run automatically. However, that has some obvious malicious implications. You can use group policies in Active Directory or the local group policy manager to tell Windows, knock that off. There's tools that will set this up for you, although if you can turn it off with software, you can turn it back on with software. So caveat emptor with those kind of products. Now, all of these things we should know about Bluetooth by the end of it. Bluetooth is a consortium-driven set of standards for how short-range wireless should happen. The two devices involved, in fact, I'm holding two, my mouse and my pen are both Bluetooth connected to my laptop. The way that they decide that they're going to be friends is this process called pairing, where they exchange numbers that transform into session keys that let them connect to each other relatively securely. So connecting your mobile to your PC is pretty common. There are Bluetooth printers, keyboards, mice. Sending files via Bluetooth is a relatively simple thing. These are great places for a man in the middle of an attack. If you can get between the keyboard and the computer and read all the keystrokes, you will know all of their passwords and all that great stuff. So it's important. Piconets, any very small ad hoc network, could be described as that. Bluetooth has authentication, authorization, and encryption, which is better than like a lot of the roll your own wireless standards that, say, keyboard manufacturers have come up with. However, it can, like any standard, be poorly implemented, and you generally don't use particularly long pins. The key length is negotiable, and the smaller the length of the key you're using for encryption, the easier it is to break into. Keys, if they become public, can be used by anybody. So in the same way that if you were to set a picture of your key on the internet, somebody could take that, have it printed out, and come unlock your door. The same is true with those. That master key between devices is shared between the two. And if you can get either side of those, if you can compromise either side of that communication, say the keyboard or the computer, you can get your hands on those keys, and then I can unlock your door again. The device is authenticated, not the user. So that's a limitation. There's no end-to-end security, and then it's sort of a rinky-dink toy kind of protocol. So there's not a ton of security built into it, but supposedly enough, so that you could trust your Bluetooth keyboard unless you were working with the launch codes. Bluejacking was originally presented to me as a marketing concept for large groups of people. And I met with a company when I was in media that their business was they would set up a radio transmitter in a concert venue or a sporting event or whatever, and they would spam messages out to people's phones. Like, nowadays, we think that's a bad thing. At the time, they seemed to think it was a good thing. I'm glad we didn't decide to commit to doing anything with that kind of technology. Blue snarfing is snarfling up whatever info you can get off of those devices. And when security holes exist that allow attackers to take control, there was a 0-day running around in the radios for Samsung. It was all of a particular class of radios, but Samsung devices happen to have them that sat around unplugged on my phone for like 3 months. That would let you take control of the device. So you kind of want to keep Bluetooth turned off when those sorts of things are about. If the key links are really short, you can break into them. If you can become a man in the middle by pairing with one device and then pairing with the other device. So I'm here and the keyboard is here and the computer is over here. If I can tell the keyboard on the computer and the computer on the keyboard, I can sit here and listen in to all of their communication. That's not good for them. And then if you've got encrypted communication, you might be able to throw the power of the internet at it and try using pin cracking attacks where you just try all the pins. Key logging is great if you can pull it off. So if you can figure out the pin, crack the pin, and then intercept all of the information between the keyboard and the Bluetooth radio that it's talking to, you can then essentially log all of the keystrokes, which is not good. Recording voice is another thing that happens, since a lot of people use Bluetooth headsets, and that encryption between the headset and the phone isn't that great. And then blueprinting lets you do sort of the same type of thing you would do with Nmap to fingerprint an operating system, but instead fingerprinting the device that you're talking about. Mostly solved, but they're bound to show back up when oversized ping packets would hit a device. They would break, which is bad, rendering them not good. And it's just a matter of time before the next one gets found. So that's why we bring those up. Blue dumping is when you can get the device to dump that stored key, and now the attacker can get in the middle. And then, like war driving, there's blue driving, where you can dive deep into the Bluetooth protocol and try all of those things we just talked about. So there's the blue driving suite, trying a bunch of different attacks in Kali. So you have protection. You can encrypt things, not use Bluetooth. If you've got a device, make sure it implements security properly. Generally speaking, buy from a reputable company. Turn down power if you can do that. Don't let any other software get installed if you can prevent it. If you're going to send sensitive data, you might want to re-authenticate and then store devices safely in a Faraday cage or make those Faraday bags now. You might keep an eye on what types of RF you're communicating with. You might make sure there's no other devices around while you're trying to pair, and turn down the network as much as you can. Turn down unnecessary SCO and ESCO. Synchronous connection options. These are one of the myriad of Bluetooth protocols. As an exercise as a student, I recommend you Google up the Bluetooth page from Wikipedia. There's about 1,000 different Bluetooth entries. And 1,000 different acronyms associated with the various connections. So be careful where you set the location. Make sure you restrict the devices that have the special resources on them, and then stay current. Patch up frequently, patch often. Next, we want to talk about RFID, or the radio frequency ID, and the countermeasures and the types of hacking that can happen. Take a look at this tool called RF dump. So to give you an idea of those technologies, talk about what happens when things collide, the security and privacy threats, and then what you can do when you enumerate all of the things in there. So radio frequency ID just basically is a device that automatically stores data and then maybe transmits it when it comes in contact with a tag reader. So the reader reads the tag and powers it while it's doing so that the computer can figure out what's going on. And you probably have one of these. They're in student IDs at the college have them now. Card readers for certain credit cards have this kind of stuff in it. The United States puts them in passports. Basically, there's a handful of different types you can get your hands on. The passive tags are powered by the reader, as I mentioned just briefly. An active tag will have a battery unto itself, and then there's often some kind of hybrid where there's power enough to run the chip when it's not working, but when it talks just like a passive tag, and the reader powers the communication. So the readers spam radio waves into the ether, and then data encrypted on the circuit is extracted by the host. So these readers come with a decoder and an antenna. They read the waves off of the tag, and if you use a tool like RF dump, you will see the output of, hey, here's this key, here's this metadata. So RFID controllers are often set up in grocery stores, retail shops, distribution centers. These are useful in tagging parts in warehouses. You see them in a lot of applications. ID cards are just probably the one that most people deal with in their day-to-day. They can connect synchronously or asynchronously. They can have all kinds of software development tools embedded, and they are good for authenticating readers. If you've got a on-premises RFID server, sometimes again, stores, distribution centers, they can check out all events, they can check commands, they can support processes like inventory management, that kind of thing. Think about like, it's still not a great technology for like a grocery store, but if I've seen them in parts for automotive, and they let you connect to send all that data back to that server. And then an integration server would do this, talk to whatever your back end software is, PeopleSoft or whatever, read all those existing sources, talk to some kind of business to business process. So talk to your inventory management system and let you pick and choose from vendors if you ever needed to replace it. So if you get too many tags coming back to the reader at the same time, it's potential to have collision like you do on a network. If you've got two readers within a close proximity of each other, it's possible for them to overlap and interfere with each other's signals or read the same tag as if it were two different places. The idea is that these are frequently used to get rid of paper-based systems. So we add RFID in the interest of doing away with our inventory system. But if one piece breaks, the whole thing can fail, and you can intentionally clone the data off of an RFID system since they're not particularly careful about what they transmit with. So they'll pretty much send the data on the chip to just about anybody. So it is since they're wireless, since they're recording information about assets, it's difficult to keep track of. So you run the risk of exposing information about your business. It is easy to sit and listen in to the RF links, since it's radio frequencies just broadcast everywhere. You can potentially query tags without people knowing it, and potentially that can lead you to the back-end database systems that know things about this by sort of following the trail. This is why there are plenty of people doing a brisk business selling RFID-proof wallets or cases that block your RFID chip from your passport, because it can compromise your privacy. So if I just walk past someone with my passport, potentially they could read it. If there are privacy laws like HIPAA and FERPA and that sort of things, businesses run the risk of running afoul of them just by virtue of having this stuff broadcast out there. Customers potentially avoid RFID technologies when they find out about it. So I know a lot of people were very eager not to get the new U.S. passport, fearing that people would just sit around airports sniffing up RFID info off of that. Since there's weak privacy protection, that you could potentially be held liable for that. So it's got its risks. I don't know as you'd need to worry too much about being electromagnetically irradiated, but potentially there is fears for your network. So they are cool that they tell you, we know that part X is at this location at this time. It can tell you all sorts of things about that. However, I can sniff that up. I can also track that as an attacker. I can spoof that and pretend to be that part or whatever, that person. I can replay the transmissions I've seen before, since these aren't generally very sophisticated systems. If I record a radio communication, I can play it back at someone. You also can deny service to these things just by flooding them. If you've got a credit card with one of these, you have all of those same problems. So people can track you. People can eavesdrop on you. Potentially, credit card skimming is an issue that goes above and beyond RFID, but potentially people could be skimming the data off of the card. You can replay and then also relay that information elsewhere. And then potentially you could cross-contaminate by getting information from one card interfering with the other. So there are plenty of blockers that will emit radio frequencies. Although RF wars are never a great idea, having an off button is a good idea. Using some kind of cryptography to keep the data secure. And then there are things like RFID guardians that will mediate interactions between the readers and the tags. Turning things off is still a good idea. And then potentially changing the outward pseudonym, or what they're called. So I wouldn't use RFID for anything super ultra secure. They're great if you want to know where the part is in the chain, but I'm leery of using them in security systems for all those reasons. All right, so USB is that port everybody's been using. They are susceptible to electrical attacks and people breaking into the computers. So if at all possible, they're good to turn off. There are cute little hacking tools. Just go to hack5.com and take a peruse of all the turtles and ferrets and other land animals that are out there. You can use security tools to recognize when things are plugged in and unplugged from USB devices, but maybe it's better just to turn them off. Similarly, turning off auto run is a good idea. Scanning things with AV is a good idea. Maybe if you don't require it in your environment, gluing the ports shut is a good idea. Bluetooth is that short-range protocol that, like, you will see with wireless phones. Blue jacking is when you hijack those networks. Blue snarfing is when you snarfle up their network. RFIDs are these cute little automatic identifications using radio waves. However, the signals can collide if the tag is duplicated or if two readers read it at the same time. There's a bunch of different technologies in there, although, you know, for manufacturing, potentially for retail, they do let you change a lot of business processes because you can do away with like scanning a barcode and that sort of thing. But in the same way, you could have multiple attacks of scanning a barcode, sniffing, tracking, spoofing, replay, and denial of service are all potential risks with these things. Countermeasures might include blocking them, turning them off, using some cryptography, detecting and evading things, and turning them off more. And that's the wireless stuff.